My name is Diane Charlton, and I am on faculty at Montana State University in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Economics. And my specialty is doing research related to farm labor markets and immigration. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about farm labor and immigration today in the United States and specifically looking at Montana as well. So, taking a quick snapshot of agriculture in the Montana economy, agriculture is Montana's leading industry. It contributed an estimated $4 billion in impact in 2017. That was $665.1 million more than the next largest industry, which was travel. Crop production in 2017 was valued at just under $1.5 billion and livestock production just over $1.5 billion. So clearly, agriculture is very important to the Montana economy. In the United States, we see that fewer and fewer people in the workforce are working in agriculture. So if we go back in time to 1900, 40% of the US population lived on farms and 60% in rural areas. Today, just 1% of the US population lives on farms and 14% in rural areas. So there was a major transition in the US workforce during the 20th century. And so this leads to the question, how has agricultural production continued with so many fewer workers employed directly in agriculture and living in rural areas? And part of that answer is through immigration. And so if we take a look at the US crop workforce, the vast majority of hired workers are foreign-born. And so this is a look from the National Agricultural Workers Survey at where crop workers were born. This survey does not include H-2A guest workers. So if we were able to include guest workers, which constitute roughly 10% of the full-time equivalent crop workforce, if we included H-2A workers, the foreign-born share would increase. But excluding H-2A, only 26% of crop workers in 2016 were born in the United States. And Mexico was the primary provider of crop workers. They made up 65% of the crop workforce, excluding H-2A. And so the United States has really created this large dependency on Mexico to provide farm workers. However, rural Mexico is going through a transition similar to the one that the United States went through in the 20th century, and fewer Mexicans are working in agriculture. And so, based on survey data that was nationally representative of rural Mexico, my co-author Ed Taylor and I a few years ago discovered that the probability that rural Mexicans work in agriculture, whether in Mexico or the United States, the probability that they work in agriculture is declining by about 1% per year. And if we look at individual census regions of Mexico, say if we look at central Mexico, where the probability of working in agriculture is much higher than, say, in northeast Mexico, even in central Mexico, there's a statistically significant negative trend in the probability of working in agriculture. And you can see this little bump here in 2007 where we were merging surveys over time. So I think that bump is largely due to some challenges in merging those surveys. But regardless, what we see here is that rural Mexicans are less and less likely to work in agriculture. So for the United States, which is dependent on this agricultural workforce, this presents some challenges. So what will U.S. agricultural production look like in the future? Will farms convert to less labor-intensive crops? So maybe tear out orchards of hand-picked peaches and plant field crops. Well, does that mean that we will import fruits and vegetables from abroad? But how much would they pay for fruits and vegetables that were grown here in the United States with the safety and pesticide regulations that the United States has in place, and just the freshness of having fruits and vegetables that maybe were grown a little bit closer to your home? There is some evidence that there are specialty markets. For example, these omakase berries that were grown in New York. It's a very specific variety of strawberry that is supposed to be superior to other varieties of strawberry. I have not tasted them, but according to the New York Times, they were selling for $50 per package of 8. So that's an extreme specialty market, but there could be various specialty markets that arise in which consumers might be willing to pay a premium for fruits and vegetables that were grown here in the United States. Will those markets be smaller? How much are consumers willing to pay for fruits and vegetables grown in the United States? And how does this diminishing farm labor supply affect even farms of less labor-intensive crops? Even field crops need workers to perform tasks throughout the year. So all of the agricultural industry is affected by this, even though some of the more labor-intensive crops obviously will be facing bigger challenges. So what can the U.S. do? If we're not going to rip out all of our labor-intensive crops and import all of our food from abroad, what can the U.S. agricultural industry do? Well, the U.S. could try to recruit workers from further abroad. The rural population of Mexico exceeds that of Central America by more than 6 million people, though. So if we're just trying to go further south, we're going to be competing with Mexico and other Central American countries for a limited supply of rural workers. Even Mexico recruits agricultural workers from Guatemala at the same time that it exports farm workers to the United States. We could try to recruit workers from further abroad. Many Asian and African countries have not transitioned out of agricultural work at the rate that Mexico has, so we could try to bring workers from further abroad. Here in Montana, we already see South Africans frequently employed on some of the farms along the High Line. But I will note that the places where we see South African guest workers employed are typically very mechanical jobs. And so if you imagine the marginal product of labor for someone who is hand picking a crop versus someone who is driving a combine to harvest a crop, the combine driver is going to be much more productive for each hour of work than the person who's hand picking. And so I think we do tend to see recruiting workers from further abroad, but typically for these more mechanical jobs where one person can accomplish a much larger quantity of work. So I think there's some limitations in terms of trying to recruit workers from further abroad, though we do see farmers and ranchers looking further abroad to try to solve some of these problems. Another solution, sort of combined in all of this, is to try to make it more efficient and less costly for farmers to recruit and hire guest workers. So I alluded to the H-2A program. Formerly, the H-2A is a guest worker visa program specifically for agriculture. Employers who are using the H-2A program have to demonstrate that no domestic workers are willing or able to perform the job. Only seasonal jobs are qualified. And the employer has to pay additional costs, including transportation from and return to the home country, and the employer has to pay for housing. The employer also has to pay at least the adverse effect wage rate, which is set by the U.S. government for each state. And so there are some additional costs. There's also some additional costs and knowledge and difficulty in terms of actually filing paperwork to hire H-2A workers. And so I like this little picture here. I pulled this off of the U.S. Department of Labor webpage a few years ago. This is a flow chart for the H-2A application process. And you can see it's just a complicated process. And I think my favorite part of this flow chart is that when you get to the end of the flow chart to this white box, it says, "Congratulations, you are ready to file with the USCIS." It doesn't even say you are ready to hire an H-2A worker. And so it's a complicated process, potentially a costly process, but despite the complications and the cost of hiring H-2A employment grew by more than 450% from 2001 to 2019. And so we're seeing more and more use of this program. It's estimated that a little over 10% of the full-time equivalent crop workforce is H-2A currently. There have been numerous efforts to streamline the H-2A program and possibly make it available for a greater variety of employers. There's been very limited, little to no success in the past to streamline this program, but I maybe remain kind of optimistic that given the increased interest and demand for using this program, maybe we'll see some improvements in the near future. What does H-2A look like in Montana? There were 984 certified H-2A positions in Montana in 2019. And I haven't looked at numbers specific to Montana, but in 2020 nationally, H-2A employment grew. So we are still continuing to see a rise in H-2A demand. But Montana specifically, 984 certified positions in 2019. The application, sometimes employers just say general farm workers, or so it's the golden here, and some of them say agricultural equipment operators, it's the dark blue. But some of them have a little more specific detail about the type of work that the H-2A workers will be doing. So this large share right here, this sort of pinkish color, is livestock. This large sort of greenish gray is grains, pulses, and hay. So even some of these more mechanized crops still are requiring seasonal workers that are recruited through H-2A. This purple is potatoes or sugar beets. And then this little brown section here is for bees and honey production. So Montana doesn't have a lot of really labor-intensive crops, but they still depend on H-2A guest workers. If we compare Montana to some of its neighbors, Idaho hired 4,609 H-2A workers in 2019. Wyoming only 472, North Dakota 1,870, and Washington State, where many of the U.S. apples are grown and other fruits and vegetables, they hired 30,650 H-2A workers in 2019. Nationally, there were 276,811 certified H-2A positions. So H-2A is increasing. It's been one of the major factor in trying to recruit more farm workers in recent years. And so as we've been seeing H-2A increase, there's been a lot of questions regarding, well, what are some of the factors that have been leading to the increase in H-2A employment? And we kind of think, is fewer Mexicans want to work in agriculture, as farm wages have been rising, labor supply seems to be getting tighter, that employers have become more dependent on H-2A. My co-author Marcelo Castillo and I sort of toying around with some of these ideas and factors that might have been leading to increased growth in H-2A, and we plotted these trends. The red here is H-2A applications from 2001 to 2017, and the blue is construction employment. And you can see that as during the construction boom in the early 2000s, H-2A applications rose. During the housing bust, 2008 to 2010, there's a major plummet in construction employment and a smaller decrease in H-2A applications. And then during the housing recovery, H-2A applications also increased. And so just looking at these trends doesn't necessarily mean that there's a causal interpretation, but we started to wonder, well, construction employs a lot of immigrants, many of whom do not have a lot of education, similar to agriculture. And perhaps when there is a housing boom, workers are more likely to move from agriculture to construction or related industries such as landscaping or increased demand for service workers. And so there's probably a lot of demand for workers in some of these industries that have traditionally employed many immigrants. And so we kind of thought, well, maybe during housing booms, there might be an increased demand for H-2A employment to replace some of the workers that might have moved to some of these non-farm industries. And so we were able to causally identify the effects of housing booms and busts on H-2A employment. And what we found was that a 1% increase in housing demand led to a 0.4 to 0.97% increase in H-2A employment on average within U.S. commuting zones from 2001 to 2017. We also found positive effects of housing demand on local farm wages, which is consistent with this theory of non-farm industries pulling workers out of agriculture and creating an inward shift in the local farm labor supply. So what does that mean for us now? Why should we care? And as I drive around and I see help wanted signs in windows at restaurants and stores and other businesses all across the Gallatin County, Montana, all across the country, that means there's a lot of opportunities in non-farm industries, and there will be more and more competition for agriculture to recruit and retain workers. One of the ways that they might do that might be through increased employment of H-2A workers who have a visa to work specifically in agriculture and cannot move to a non-farm job. So what are some other solutions? We talked about recruiting workers from further abroad, potentially streamlining the H-2A guest worker visa program. What are some other solutions that the farm industry is looking into? One of those solutions is creating more robotic harvesters. Robots began harvesting strawberries on commercial farms for the first time this past year, at least as far as I know, it's the first time. These robots have been in the making for many years, and they finally created a robot that can feasibly harvest strawberries for similar cost to human pickers. So these harvesters are currently made by Tortuga AgTech and are commercially available. I think there are relatively few robotic harvesters available just yet, but as they continue to work out kinks and get more of a streamlined process for creating these robots, I expect we'll see more and more of them harvesting our strawberries. So they use an arm to move its sensor array around the leaves, and they have machine vision to actually identify ripe strawberries and pick only the ripe strawberry by snipping the strawberry from the stem and gently placing it in a clamshell. This robot only works with tabletop grown strawberries. Most strawberries in the United States currently are grown in fields. So there are efforts to create robots that would be more conducive for use with the way that we currently grow strawberries here in the US. But this is a major step, and I think we will probably see more robotic harvesters for our fruits and vegetables in the future. Some of these mechanical solutions require a lot of innovation in terms of biology and breeding new varieties as well. The most classic example is the automated tomato harvester of the 1960s. Agricultural engineers teamed up with plant breeders. Plant breeders had to create a tomato that ripened uniformly so that the harvester could come in and harvest all the tomatoes at once. And they had to breed a tomato that was tough enough that it wouldn't just get beat up by the harvester. And so that was developed in the 1960s, the tomato harvester, along with that variety of tomato that could actually perform with the harvester. And that is the source of our processing tomatoes today. I think this article is kind of interesting in that it continues to show these efforts to breed plant varieties that require fewer workers. This is the Supreme grape. I actually don't know if anyone is commercially growing this grape, but raisin grapes used to be the most labor-intensive crop grown in North America. Workers would have to go and hand pick canes, clusters of grapes from the vines and place them on paper trays between the trellises. And they would sit there on the trellises and dry in the sun, and then they would go through and roll up those paper trellises, stack them at the ends of the rows, and then take a forklift through and pick up all of the paper trays filled with with raisins. There were some major developments in the 1980s to develop varieties of grapes that workers could go through and just snip the canes, and the canes would just sort of dangle there on the vine and dry there on the vine, and then they could come through and mechanically harvest those raisins from the vine. And so that reduced labor demand substantially in raisin production. And this farmer had an innovative idea in which he managed to breed a variety of grape that naturally dries on the vine without even going through and snipping the vines. So lots of innovative ideas and people in the agricultural industry who are working on these new innovations. Integrated weed management has greatly reduced labor demand during the growing season. So we're not looking only at solutions during harvest, but also solutions throughout the year. So lettuce is traditionally hand thinned using a hoe, but machine vision and spray systems can now be used to thin lettuce. And weeds were traditionally removed mechanically only between rows and manually within the rows. But with this integrated weed management system, weeds can robotically be removed intra-row, and this reduces hand weeding times by 20 to 40%. So there are a number of technologies currently available, new technologies being developed, and I think we will see more and more of these technologies in the agricultural industry in the years to come. Agriculture is not the only industry that is trying to automate, and if we just look further down the supply chain as well in agriculture, we're seeing efforts to automate. So for example, Tyson plans to spend over $400 million a year to increase automation in meat plants. Restaurants are using robots to help serve food for a cost of $1,000 a month, and restaurants are using flippy robots to fry food for a cost of $3,000 a month. And so we're seeing a lot of these changes in many industries that traditionally hired immigrants and workers with relatively little education. And so what does the future in agriculture look like in terms of the workforce? There will be efforts to mechanize, to develop robotics, breed new varieties, and adopt precision agriculture to make the efforts of every worker more productive. And as we consider these changes that are on the horizon, there's a lot of questions going forward. So what kinds of skills will farms require in the future? What kinds of technical, mechanical, and data analytics skills will be needed on farms to use these technologies effectively? How do we educate and train the farm workers of tomorrow? And will the U.S. recruit college-educated farm workers from Mexico to work with these technologies, or possibly even further abroad? Or will most of these workers come from the United States, from programs like FFA and our college programs, such as agricultural business and agricultural engineering? And so how do we continue to prepare for the future, a more mechanized future, and how do we train workers of tomorrow? Thank you.